I want to invite you into a restaurant. Not a fast food restaurant, maybe a little bit of a higher end restaurant. It's a restaurant that's been there for a long, long time. And in the restaurant, there's a chef. No one really knows the chef that well. But what they do know is the food that comes out of the restaurant is amazing. And all they ever really see of the chef is shadows that come out of the kitchen door. And the shadows tell of the chef as she dances around her kitchen, making some of the most beautiful food. People come from all over the place to have food made from this chef. And her specialties: butternut squash soup with ginger and maple syrup, filet mignon with wild mushroom risotto, and chocolate mousse with raspberry. The food, always cooked to perfection. At this restaurant, there is a waiter. The waiter's been there almost as long as the chef. The waiter loves his customers. He loves that reaction when he delivers the butternut squash soup. They take their first bite, and the reaction on their face says that they've been transported home to a different time in a different place. He loves it when his customers first take a bite of that filet mignon. A little bit of wild mushroom risotto on top. And it looks to them like it's the best thing they have ever eaten. And he loves it when his customers polish off their plate of the chocolate mousse and there's not anything left on the plate. The waiter is attentive to his customers. When they get upset, he tries to remedy it, but it happens very little. And then there's a customer. The customer's name, we'll call him Cliff. And he's been coming to this restaurant almost as long as the restaurant has been open. And he sits at the same table all the time, table 49. They know that Cliff comes in on a Thursday night and sits at table 49. And Cliff, without fail, orders the butternut squash soup, the filet mignon, and the chocolate mousse with raspberry. He's been doing it for a very long time. But one day, he comes into the restaurant. He's unhappy. He's been at a job for a long time with a bit of an abusive boss. His boss is not good to his employees. And he comes in and he tells the waiter, and the waiter understands and puts it on his mind that he's going to take extra care of Cliff today. So, brings him water, makes sure it's always refilled. And he brings out the butternut squash soup. It's the same temperature that the butternut squash soup is always served at. They keep the pot at the same temperature, and they bring it out to Cliff. Cliff takes a spoonful, and he looks at the bowl, he looks at his spoon. He can't understand why this soup, for him, is too cold. He calls the waiter over, he's agitated, he says, "My soup is cold." And the waiter says, "But this is the temperature we always serve it at." Cliff says, "No, it's cold. Like, this soup is cold. Take it back." So the waiter takes it back. The waiter tells the chef. They heat up a bowl even hotter than normal and bring it out to Cliff. When the filet mignon arrives, Cliff cuts into it. He looks at it and he says, "This isn't cooked enough. This is worse than rare." Waiter comes over, he takes a look at it, and Cliff gets very angry at the waiter. "I don't understand why the food is so off today." And the waiter says, "This is the way we always cook a medium rare filet mignon. Cliff says, no, this is not cooked. And the waiter looks, and it's cooked properly, but he takes it back anyways. The chocolate mousse comes out. Cliff doesn't get more than 2 bites in before he throws up his arms. Calls over the waiter, and he's furious. He gets up, and his face is red, and he puts his fists on the table, and he says, do you not know how to do your job? What is wrong with you? And he leaves just enough money to pay for the bill, but no more, and he leaves the restaurant. Next slide. When Cliff gets home, his partner asks, when the waiter gets home, the waiter asks, how was your day? And the waiter says, we had a meltdown at table 49. And then there's the Israelites. They're in the desert. They've been through the Sea of Reeds. They've had the bitter water that we talked very briefly about last week. They have the manna and the quail. And this time, they're thirsty again. They've camped at Rephidim. They look around. They see no water. They complain to Moses. They say, where is the water? And Moses says to God, I think these people are going to get rid of me in a hurry. God says, take some of the elders, go up ahead of the camp, and when you get up there, I'll show you a rock. And that staff with which you struck the Nile, strike this rock, and water will come out of it. So it does. And there's water for everyone to drink. Now, in the story of the restaurant, who is the provider of the gift? It is the chef. Right? The chef dances around her kitchen and makes this exquisite food. In the story of the Exodus, who is the provider of the gift? It is God. God provides the water. Who delivers the gift? In the story of the restaurant, it's the waiter. The waiter brings the gift out. In the story of Exodus, it is Moses. Moses is the one leading him through the Red Sea and finding the quail and the manna and instructing them how to use it, and eventually striking the rock at Massah and Meribah. Who is frustrated and complains in this story? Well, in the restaurant, it's mostly Cliff. Maybe the waiter does a little bit of complaining to the chef, but Cliff does most of it. In the story of the Exodus, it's the people. And how is the event remembered? Well, the story of the restaurant, it's the meltdown at table 49. I can imagine the waiter many years from now telling the story about the meltdown at table 49. In the story of the Exodus, it's Massah and Meribah. Moses labels this event, Massah and Meribah, where the people whined and complained. And who is the complaint really about? In the story of the restaurant, Cliff is complaining to the waiter, but it's really complaining about the food, right? He's complaining directly to the waiter, but it's about the food that's being created in the kitchen. In the Exodus, it's different. In the Exodus, it's exactly the same. It's the people complain to Moses, but they're really complaining about the gifts that have been given. So here's the idea. Here's where I tell this story. Because Moses is just the gift deliverer, he sees the complaint as one against God. So though the people are complaining directly to Moses, Moses sees them as complaining really about God and what God's provision has been. Next slide. So this story is a story about remembering. Now, I think there are different kinds of ways of remembering, and there are different things we remember. So there are bad memories that we remember, right? And there are bad memories that we forget. And there are good memories that we remember, and good memories that we forget. Okay, so this is important. Okay, so I'll just run you through a couple of examples. Okay, next slide. 3 years ago, I was studying in Halifax, and we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission come to Halifax. We got to attend the Truth and Reconciliation events. There was this big plenary space. It had maybe 2,000 chairs in it, and people would come and listen to stories. But off to the side, there were circles of maybe 12 or 14 people. They would sit in circles, and the public was invited to come and sit in concentric circles around them. So there might be 50 or 60 people in one of these rooms. And I remember sitting there one afternoon and listening to the stories as they went around the circle. Terrible stories of abuse, of manipulation, of cultural genocide. We just listen to these stories. At the end of this circle, one of the elders said, "I think we should pray." So everyone stood up and he sang this most beautiful song. And I remember standing there and tears streaming down my face. And it felt like an incredibly holy moment. And I will remember that. And I will remember their stories. And we remember stories like those so they never happen again. That's why we study history. So that these things that sometimes we do to each other, we never do again. But sometimes we forget things. We forget terrible things. Anyone know this photo? You've probably just seen it in the news over the last little bit. Serena Vermeesh, as I think her name is pronounced. She was killed just here in Vancouver, just outside of Vancouver. And she was killed by a guy who got out of jail after being in jail for 22 years. And everyone said, before his release, he's almost certainly going to reoffend, right? That's what they said. The penitentiary said it, the justice system said it, the parole board said it. You know what we've forgotten? We've forgotten that our justice system, our jail system, is not a system of rehabilitation. It takes yet another example of an offense to remind us that our jails are not rehabilitating people. It's something we need to remember. Regardless of whether we think he should have been locked up for life, we need to remember that our prison system is failing. But then we remember good things too. Just one example, Thanksgiving meals. I have fond memories of Thanksgiving meals. Big turkey dinners, pots of stuffing and potatoes and carrots and pumpkin pie. We're going to celebrate it again soon. It's a way of remembering. It's a way of giving thanks for all the incredible things in the world, to give thanks for a harvest season. We remember good things. And sometimes we also forget good things too. If you've ever spent any amount of time in a place like New York City or Chicago or Toronto, the place just seems to suck you in miles and millions of cubic feet of concrete. And you forget that smell as you're walking through the woods. You forget the experience of paddling on the ocean. And sometimes we simply forget how incredible the world is, how incredible nature is, when we're in a place like New York or Chicago. That doesn't go for everyone, but we can forget. I think remembering is an act of faith. It's one of the many things we do as a community of faith. We remember. We remember stories of Scripture. We remember the stories of how these stained glass lights were created or how the windows were made. We remember. In the story of Meribah and Massah, the Israelites are invited to remember. And they're invited to remember two things. They're first invited to remember that they whined and complained. That's where the name comes from, Meribah and Manasseh, testing and complaining. And yet, at the same time, that place represents great provision. There was water from a rock in the middle of the desert. And so, hung up in this story is both a memory of provision and a way to fix themselves. It's tied up in the story. And so we do this as a community of faith, week after week, year after year, as we remember the way God moves and works in the world. Amen.